One thing I will never grasp is America's obsession with free speech and personal freedom over anything else. So as a Canadian, I was taught that my free speech and personal freedom ends where other people's right to integrity and respect begins. Now it's not surprising, it's literally the most basic concept for a society to function properly. However, when I tell my point of view to my southern friends, they seem to hold a completely different point of view where free speech is absolute and it means freedom from consequences. I think that obsession can become quite lethal, notably in the case of the COVID-19 pandemic, where people prioritize their personal freedom in this idea that the government is not coercing them over their security and the well-being of others, when all is asked for them to do is to wear a piece of cloth over their mouth when they're near other people and to get a 5-second free vaccine. This whole my body, my choice thing, which is quite ironic considering their take on abortion. So yeah, I talked to an American the other day, and he kept arguing that America was better than Canada because you guys have hate speech laws, as if being prohibited from publicly endorsing a genocide and spewing out harmful rhetoric and outrageous things is literally 1984. Thinking that freedom of speech means freedom of consequences is very childish, and I'd really love to see what goes on in the mind of people who think like that. Unfortunately, this idea of absolute freedom seems to be the basis of the entire worldview of a lot of American conservatives, ultra-liberals, and libertarians, which includes any kind of economic intervention or government regulation, even though a lot of the time it is justified or even necessary for the capitalist economy they advocate for to even survive. This usually goes along the lines of taxation is theft, while they enjoy good public services, utilities, a police, a military, a consumer protection office, good road infrastructure. That this kind of thinking is idealistic, it's utopian. The idea of absolute freedom only applies if capitalism as a system is non-existent, because absolute liberty in the context of capitalism paves the way to neoliberalism. Deregulation, privatization, destruction of worker rights, a drop in living conditions for workers, and even a climate disaster. Regulation and intervention are there to protect the consumer, the worker, and even the system itself from collapsing. It's not there to remove freedom from people. For example, in the case of Quebec, where I live, we have a very strong problem with the housing market. It is way too expensive, so there needs to be some kind of economic regulation to keep people from being out there on the streets. First of all, setting a low price ceiling for housing, for apartments, and this first of all creates a scarcity in the housing markets because a lot of landlords will stop renting their apartments because it will be not as profitable. What can be done to remediate this is construct public housing, which a lot of tenant unions have been forcing the government to do. So when the disequilibrium is created, the government can subsidize housing, create public housing, but I think the best way to do that is for the government to use taxpayer money to build social housing. This will not only boost the economy, help people off the street, the government can also impose rent-to-own plans, which means once a person has rented up until the threshold where the value of that building would be, they own the place. A last thing I would like to add is how people define freedom. Because a lack of government intervention, like I have said, is not freedom. Because I think people have a lot more freedom to live their own life and actually make their own choices if they are not coerced to live in a poor living condition. If the government is there to help people who need it and is there as a backup, people don't have to worry about losing their job, about living on the street, about going homeless. And I think this is more of a conception of freedom, being able to not worry about spending money, about going broke, really. Not being able to worry if you'll be able to feed your family. I think this is a much better definition of freedom than the total absence of government intervention. Hopefully this is a path to reflect on the idea of freedom.